We're
All right.
live.
Hey there. Chris, can you hear my voice okay? Excellent. This is our first time, everybody. Welcome. Hello, and this is the kickoff for the Straight Talk for Government chapter. My name's Trace Bannon. Background, I'm an architect, software engineer, developer, digital change agent, nerd who loves to work with others to really get some of these conversations happening. I work with the MITRE Corporation, and today, Chris Hughes and I will be your moderators. Chris, do you mind introducing yourself?
Yeah, definitely. My name is Chris Hughes. Been doing federal and public sector cybersecurity over 15 years. Active duty Air Force. I was a Navy civilian, a civilian with FedRAMP, and now co-founded a company named Acquia.
So thank you so much. So ST for G, Straight Talk for Government. It is a new chapter of the DevOps Institute. We're affiliated with the DevOps Institute. As opposed to being something that is strictly regional, we're starting this journey in a very virtual manner. The DevOps Institute and our organization are focused on enabling government. The whole idea is to have open community, open conversation across government, academia, across industry, research groups like MITRE, like SEI. We're going to post out a couple of different things for you. Today, we are broadcasting for the first time, trying out this LinkedIn thing. We may fail. If we do, we'll fail together and we'll learn from it together. We do have a new page that I'll be posting over into the comments section, and that'll be our Straight Talk for Government chapter page, and you'll be able to follow that and reference that going forward. So together, the idea is that this community will evolve to what the community needs it to be. After a round of seeding, sensing, surveys, and a lot of conversations, we're starting out with a monthly coffee chat. And it is based on topics that are top of mind, those things that we really need to know more about. Probably the hottest topic in recent weeks has been the set of DOD memos, and in particular about software development and open source. So we have invited two very distinguished guests with us today. The first is Jason Weiss. Jason is the Chief Software Officer for the Department of Defense. He also wears the hat as the Director of Software Modernization. Hello, Jason. Thank you for joining us.
Hey, thanks for having me. Excited to be here today.
Thank you so much. And the other fellow who's here with us today is Rick Jack. He is a Senior Scientific Technical Manager for NWIC PAC. He's also one of the founding members of the Straight Talk for Government chapter. Hey, Rick, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Tracy. Thanks for having me.
So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to post out the link so that anyone who hasn't taken a look at the memo can pull that up on your own. Chris, why don't you kick us off with a couple of questions?
Yeah, definitely. So the first question I wanted to ask is, just given the widespread adoption and use and kind of growing popularity of open source software, are there any specific factors that led to the publication of this memo?
Yeah, so I'll take that one. So the original memo that we had was dated, I think, 2009. So it was a little long in the tooth, right? At this point, we're in 2022. So it was, when we started reworking this, it was well beyond 10 years old in age. But I have to be honest that the impetus that really drove this was a GAO report, 19457 or something like that. And in that report, they said that the DoD needs to really fully implement and pilot how we deal and provide open source, both consume and contribute back to the community. And so we took a lot of that input and we also linked that with a congressional requirement. The 2018 NDAA Section 875 created a statutory obligation on the department around open source software as well. And so all these things kind of fortuitously came together at the same time, and we were able to, as they say, kill two birds with one stone. And that led to the creation of this revised memo with additional guidance. And it had been long overdue, and we're excited to see all the conversation that has resulted as a result of that publication.
Awesome. As a quick follow-on question, obviously, end of last year, we saw some pretty notable open source security incidents, right? Was that part of this effort, or do you think that at least played a part in the conversation leading up to this publication?
Yeah. So having been, if you've ever been around government, you know that it's consensus driven, and that very rarely outside of Hollywood does somebody with a bunch of stars snap their fingers and poof, magic happens. we have a system we call CADMs. I've publicly referred to it with some loving terms of endearment, but coordinating any sort of memo or document like this is a very lengthy process. And so it's a long answer for saying, no, this had been in work for many months. A lot of people worked on this. A lot of people reviewed this, provided great input and suggestions that we had to adjudicate, to use the right nomenclature, before we were able to put it forward and actually get a signature. So it just sort of happened that the timing synced up.
So I'm going to ask a question here. The memo calls out the need for software developed that wasn't for national security to be thought about as open sourced or published through avenues like code.gov, code.mil. Do you think it's important? And Rick, I'll ask you this. How important is it to you for the DOD, for the Navy to become not just consumers but open source, but start to contribute?
Well, yeah, so that's a great question. I think it's actually part of a key strategy. And I think the memo is very timely because, as we know, software is eating the world. And I think, what was a struggle for most of DOD was the aspect of what we're dealing with open source and how it's actually a lot more prolific in society today. I mean, if we take, I'm just use a commercial example, almost every software project or effort you have is almost a majority open source, and about 20%, 30% is actually handwritten or proprietary. So if the majority of software in the commercial sector is adopting more of an open source approach, even our major industry providers do this, the DoD doing the same exact approach makes a lot of sense. So I would think that, as far as taking in open source software, it's probably a lot more prolific than most people realize. They just don't look. And so this memo actually provides enough traction for people to realize that open source is a part of the strategy, and we have to start paying attention to it because it does drive a part of the equation, like in terms of how do we acquire things, how do we consume all the deliverables, how do we do dependency management, and all of those things that are really impactful. Now, when you talk about contributions back in terms of the software, I feel that's a very important part of the conversation as well, because if we're going to invest as a government entity, the contributions back actually need to be forefront. But I would like to say that, from a personal opinion, I think it probably already happens. We just don't track it as much. I mean, even when I was on software development projects, when I used open source software and I took a library or something like that and I modified it, I would tend to contribute back. And I think, as I review a lot of our software efforts, that tends to happen where we don't take advantage or we don't advertise it as much. But I think it's right for time we start tracking those kinds of things and deal with those.
Well, let me take the same question and turn it to Jason, but let me add on to it with a little bit more. The memo calls out code.gov, code.mil, and I've heard some varying opinions. Did a little bit of work with code.gov from the civilian side of the house, and some might say it's a good place when I'm done with my project to deposit my project code. How do projects or how do programs and products, how do those really start to contribute into code.gov, code.mil? Do you think that they have the right processes in place for us to be able to really start to leverage them as our open source contribution sites?
Yeah, I think it's a complicated problem. It's not complex, but it's definitely complicated because the DoD, on one hand, we have national security systems and we have legal obligations to protect those systems, and in particular their secret sauce. Apologize for the dog. We have a delivery at the door. On the other hand, we have Congress saying, "Hey, look, per the NDAA, you need to be releasing code that's not critical." And so finding that balance is going to be a challenge for the department. To your point about it being just a code repository, we have a long ways to go to figure out how the DoD participates in the culture of open source. One of the things that has always struck me is that take a Git repository. We have a lot of Git repositories across the department, and a lot of those repositories hold unclassified source code. And so we don't necessarily want to encourage code.mil, code.gov, any of these places to become a dumping ground for a program that has run its course. What we need to figure out culturally and from a budgeting standpoint, how do we go out there and find something like the DoD equivalent of a GitHub where we actually can engage collaboratively, not just with DoD, but with the broader community in real time. And I think that scares a lot of people, because proving the provenance of a contribution is one thing. I could track back through the history and get proving the identity and the intentions of the individuals providing that commit is a whole different problem. And when you're in the defense industry and you're dealing with national security systems, it's hard to go, I don't care over here and I care over here.
Mm-hmm.
You have to say universally, I want to be secure across the board. And so it's hard to let your guard down sometimes on the unclass side.
Well, it's a interesting conversation when you think about who those contributors are. I'm noticing a real surge in some pretty interesting organizations, some private companies that are coming up with some interesting ways that they look to help people manage, understanding where the contribution is coming from, tracking back to IP sources and other things. Have you started to look at some of that ecosystem and work with some of those, small vendors or new idea players?
So there's a lot of activities that are ongoing in this and other regards, right? This is the jurisdiction, I'll use that term, of our cybersecurity directorate. And they look at a lot of different aspects of software, its provenance. They look at things like SBOM, and I think SBOM is only part of the equation. I don't think it's a complete solution. And we'll certainly see as the adoption of SBOM grows, the value there is in the consumption, not the generation of the SBOM. And so people will look at creating novel ways to consume that data and blend that with other open source intelligence and offer new insights about what you're seeing. There was a particular pilot that I don't know if they've open sourced it yet, but it was out of In-Q-Tel Labs. And their intention at the time was to open source it, where they took some data from one of the DARPA bake-offs where you get a lot of people submitting code. And it was really eye-opening to see all these teams, the commonality of certain frameworks and libraries, and those one or two frameworks that were like way out here in left field.
Mm-hmm.
Just being able to visualize that and allow a program manager or a CISO to go, why did you pick that one? What was so novel about that one that these others that are common, maintained, well-known, why did you go over there? And it's not that they went over there that would personally bother me. It's that rationale that I want to understand in that conversation. But I mean, there's definitely a lot of activities around SBOMs, open source, provenance, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that not just the DoD, not just the government, I think all of us as a community will benefit from the fruit of their labor.
And
if I could pile on it,
please, Rick.
I love that Mr. Weiss kind of mentioned that, because, I think Mr. Weiss talked about there's a cultural aspect to open source that is a real journey. Let's just say that, because, for software development, in terms of a very myopic approach to it, it tends to fix itself by an outcome. But as an organizational unit, adopting a culture from multiple aspects takes a little bit of discipline. I'll use the GitHub example because that's a perfect one. I think there's a lot of folks who feel like, hey, we'll just submit our efforts to public domain and it's all good to go. But there's a cultural aspect to managing the contribution itself that we have to adopt. I'll take, for example, a contribution back to a Linux distribution. If I'm a developer and I make a contribution back to Linux distribution, there's a mechanism and a process for adoption inclusion. And so when changes get made to those libraries, if things occur that add risk, the culture is to understand, hey, there's a process for actually doing those things. And sometimes you get kicked out. I've seen a lot of our folks tend to not, be invited back to those contributions because they tended to not add value. So that being said, that actually directly applies to the SBOM equation. We used to call it supply chain risk back in the day, which is when you're taking components of software, and Mr. Weiss said this, is just a pure understanding and knowing why you chose those things is a value proposition in itself, because now it gives you an ability to pivot where pivot is needed. For example, hey, did that library come from China? That's probably an important thing to understand. And if you chose to do it, why did you make that choice? Those are so powerful in terms of the ability to actually adopt these principles. Because remember, when we talk about software is about trust, right? And so if we can't get to the idea that what we're building is trustworthy, you're still going to have some cultural challenges to get over.
Yeah, and I'll just interject quick, Rick. It's just Jason. I was an enlisted sailor.
Okay, sorry.
I wanted to ask you both a follow-on question to that. You talked a lot about choice and security and implications of that sort. The memo also points out the need to secure open source software as well as using securing off-the-shelf COTS tooling too. But there's always concerns of vendor lock-in, for example. Any recommendations how to weigh the risk or reward of when selecting COTS versus open source? And as Rick points out, most software is actually composed of open source to begin with, whether it is COTS or strictly open source anyways.
Rick, you want to start that one?
Sure. Yeah, that's a great question, Chris. This is always a trade space conversation. For those of us who've been developing software for a long time, realize that there's always a decision to be made in terms of the choices you're doing when you're developing and composing a system. The adoption methodology is where I think open source really provides a lot of value. So the choices that you have to do in order to go down those paths, really, you have to take a step back and stop getting too wrapped up in the technical sides of the equation, because all of us software developers go, yeah, I could just develop this. I'll pull applications from my libraries and I'm ready to go. But from a management perspective, when we're making those decisions, there's a trade space that has to be considered when you're going down the open source route versus a pure commercial buying a commercial product. And so it's really a value proposition, right? Because and here I'll say this is my opinion. I think too often people assume open source is free, and I think that comes with a risky position, because yes, by definition, consuming a piece of software is free, but managing it in terms of the labor that's required is still something you have to consider. And so if that's something a commercial company is doing for you on your behalf, and it's done for more of an optimized approach because there's a greater aspect to the community, then that makes a lot of sense. But if you're making software that's more maybe domain specific, for the DOD, and now you're using open source software, you should highly consider, how do you organize to make sure you're managing those trade space discussions, and it's actually part of your process. Like, when we think about a capability that's delivered, we tend to think of it as a big monolithic idea. Here's a project, here's a capability. But now that you're putting software on the table, and the ability and the idea that software changes extremely fast, that has to be part of your decision variable. Like, hey, your cyber threats are going to be you have to be cognizant of them. Your components, they may be more. You have dependencies. What are you going to do about dependency management? How do we know if you have prominence and pedigree on all the aspects? How do we know that when you have a variation in something, that we can keep up with the cadence that's going to be occurring at a lot higher pace? So that's just it from my perspective.
You pick up a couple of really good points there, Rick. One of them is around, I call it defensible decision making. So if you're doing those architectural trades, or you have somebody who's doing those trades for you, being able to annotate. It doesn't need to be a 6-month science fair project, but being able to be very clear about why you selected it and what the risk and what the reward were. Sounds like it's also top of mind for you. Jason, I'm going to toss the same question over to you that Rick just answered.
Yeah, I think the one area that I'll build on what Rick said was we often are forced to look at features and functionality versus lock-in. The vendors will always tout their proprietary value. Some will tout their maintenance and what they bring to the table in that regard as well. But I'll illustrate with an example, right? I lived in Houston, Texas for almost 15 years. And over that 15-year period, if I were to have focused on buying a car with features like a rear window defroster, heated seats, heated steering wheel, those things were nifty, but honestly, in Houston, Texas, they would get used. When I think back over 15 years there, I probably would have used them like 3 or 4 times. Was that worth all the extra cost to go towards a particular feature set? Fast forward to where I live today in New England, and I can't imagine buying a car without those things, right? And so the more you understand and appreciate the dynamics of your use case and evaluate that use case of what you're needing versus what you're wanting and what you think is just cool, I think that also is an area that we see our acquisition professionals have to start to weigh in and understand is the I don't want to name any name brands, I'll be nice, but like is the boring sedan of value still, or do I need that really fancy sports car, right? And often people will look at open source because it's volunteers contributing their time and their energies. They don't have the splashy marketing materials. They don't have the roadmaps. They don't have all of the fancy PowerPoint decks and the marketing presence to go out there and try and sell what they've donated to the greater good. And it's easy to get caught up in that blitz of Hollywood, look at all the big releases, look at all the things we bring to the table. Well, am I going to actually leverage those to the point where I'm going to risk vendor lock-in, or I'm going to risk taxpayer dollars and invest it significantly more cost to get that snazzy thing? There are things like word processors. I spent a lot of time in Word in my current position, writing memos, policy, reading stuff, more than I wish I did. I miss my IDE dearly. I don't know that I used 15, 20% of the features of the word processor that's on my laptop, right? But I'm paying for them, and I'm being told, look at all the new features rolling out every year. It's worth the cost, but I don't know. And so I look at open source and I look at the vendor lock-in, and I think it's important. If you're going to go down that proprietary approach, you need to do it informed. And if you're well informed and you look at the list of must-haves, the list of nice-to-haves, and you go, yeah, I think I can look the taxpayers in the eye and this is worth it, then you've done your due diligence and go forth. Bring the right tool to the right job for the warfighter. But if you're just caught off guard by the fancy blitz and the sexy marketing slicks, and you're like, hey, yeah, this is where we need to go. Look at that open source thing over there. That's completely unacceptable. And I think that's going to be part of the cultural change and the education that happens with our acquisition force, is that we can't just judge a book by its cover.
There's another side of that too, which is not all decisions to use something that's coming from industry is necessarily a lock-in that's insurmountable, right? It's across the continuum. How open are the standards that they're using? Are they API open so that I'm leveraging their engines and I can invoke from the front end and not get as tightly coupled to those things? So I don't want everybody to always be afraid of making decisions because they're afraid of lock-in, because there's lock-in that everything is proprietary from somebody owning your data down to the bare metal that they're providing you, and then there are degrees of that as you get into less lock-in and the ability to extract from that. Right, that's part of the risk trade-off. Is if we use this, what's the cost? What's the tech debt that I take on? Am I going to be able to extract myself from that situation or replace it with something else?
And I think Kubernetes is the poster child for that, right? If you fast forward, if you rewind 2015, there was no Kubernetes in 2015,
right?
And now it's everywhere, and it's easy to go, but I'm using the pure open source Kubernetes. I don't have any vendor lock-in. But you better be at least acknowledging and understanding the new risks that you've taken on by locking into the Kubernetes API. Exactly. And that could be more challenging to replace for whatever was invented, say, last year that we don't know about, that's not mainstream yet, but it will be here in 2025.
Exactly. Loosely coupled all the way, wherever we can. I want to pause for just a second. Mr. Hughes, Chris, I see a lot of things scrolling up the right-hand side.
A lot of questions. Let me throw a couple of these out here right now, actually. So one of the first questions that came in, we've mentioned SBOM a couple of times. One of them was, will we see SBOM specific guidance coming out? And I did want to caveat that, and out of curiosity, like, will we just lean on, CISA and NTIA and their SBOM, leadership and guidance that they've been putting out, or will DOD have some specific, additional guidance, or what are your thoughts on that, both of you?
Rick, you want to take that one, bro?
Yeah, let's rewind the clock about a year and a half ago, and I'd ask anybody what the definition of SBOM was. Nobody could tell me. So I think as we go forward with this, with the nature of what its intent was, which was, hey, we need to understand the composition of software. I've been doing DoD software for about 25 years, and I can remember about 25 years ago having the same conversation, which is called a CI component index of your software. That being said, what I would hope that comes out of this is just alignment behind a standard. I can produce any artifacts today out of a set of composition of software, but the real question is what format do you want it? Just like Jason said, do you want me to put it in Word and email it to you, or do you want it in some XML style JSON format? So just leaning on what industry kind of has proven to be valuable to the conversation, I think will go a lot further. So from my perspective, whatever DoD aligns to, I just hope it's standards based, and we just stick to that, and then we'll be able to adopt it very easily.
So there's a system called a PLM, Product Lifecycle Management. Right? Been around for years. And part of the PLM is the ability to manage a BOM, a bill of materials. And in the manufacturing world, you don't have a supply chain bill of materials, an SC BOM, a shipper's bill of materials, right? An SH BOM, like, it's just a BOM. And it's all managed to the entire life of that product, from the time that it's digital engineering started to the time that it's being retired and recycled. That whole life cycle is managed. I personally hate the term that we've created a new type of BOM as though we're special, right? Oh, it's a software bill of materials. It's an SBOM, which it's just a BOM at the end of the day. And there are lots of BOMs. And when you look at cyber physical systems, we need all of this to come together, a la a PLM, so that we can understand risk of everything from chips to shipping routes to you name it and in between. When I look at where we're headed, it's clear there's presidential directives here at play, right? Those executive orders have stipulated what has to happen. And I will tell you that the DoD and everything from zero trust to almost assuredly SBOM will have our own opinionated perspective on what is right for the Defense Department. That's not to say that we wouldn't be standards based, but CISA kind of punted, right? They're like, oh, look, there's all these standards. SPDX, Cyclone DX, SWID. They're all standards. They're all open. Great. Okay. Well, I can tell you from my experience working with data sets, yeah, I can morph data into any other form algorithmically. Data it's not like ammunition, a kinetic round that's going down range. I can sit here and twist data into all different shapes in perpetuity and still have the original in its sacrosanct condition. But that doesn't mean that I should entertain 3 or 5 or 7 or whatever different standards and have to deal with all of that. Because once you start getting into key value pairs, well, now your key is different than my key. And how do I track all of that? And so I do believe that the DoD will be opinionated on where we land with SBOM. I don't know what that decision will be, and it would be premature and wrong for me to speculate on that here, but I will tell you that from a CDO perspective, the Chief Data Officer, they define data standards. From a CS, Cybersecurity Directorate perspective, they are the lead Office of Primary Responsibility for our SBOM activities. From an IE, Information Enterprise Directorate, where I sit, I look at DevSecOps and our software supply chain, and I want to consume these SBOMs, and I want to understand how I can do that in an automated and efficient manner to reduce our risk. So long answer for a short answer variant of yes, the DoD will be opinionated on this.
But, I'm really excited with what I just heard. There's a pragmatism, but there's not a push. You're not giving this a Heisman. You're actually saying, this is how it's going to be, and we've got to figure out how to make this work. National security is at risk here. There are lives at stake here, and we can really leverage these kinds of things in the context of what we're doing in the government space. That's super exciting to hear you say that, and I'm sure that the folks who are on the line with us right now are thinking the same thing. Chris, I'm seeing a myriad more questions.
Yeah,
up here. Is there another one you want to pop out?
Yeah, there's a kind of a few that kind of trend together. There was one that says, why not just use GitHub and GitLab themselves? And they threw out like a NSA link to GitHub. And then also it says, when do you just decide to use GitHub or GitLab instead of a government specific solution?
Yeah, so we have these things called impact levels, right? Impact level 2 is commercial. Impact level 4, impact level 5, impact level 6. 6 is where you get into the secret classification, and there are regulations, and some of them are statutory driven because of national security systems that stipulate where we can put things. We have systems working on PII and PHI, even their test data. They can't have that out there in the public domain. And I think there's a certain value, even the estimates I've read from companies like Sneak that talk about 80% of source code is open source, the rest is the secret sauce and proprietary. We have an obligation to the warfighter to bring them home to their families, and sometimes that means that secret sauce doesn't belong on GitHub. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's classified top secret and you need to have like a poly and we need the signature that you're going to sign over your firstborn to us to use that or to see that source code, but it doesn't belong on GitHub. We will label that as controlled unclassified information for a reason. Just like there are algorithms that are proprietary in business that are called trade secrets. A corporation can file a patent, they can file a copyright, and in doing so, they are opening up their kimono and saying, here is the exact way, the exact process that we do this. And in return, the federal government promises that they will give them so many years of protection from somebody else stealing that. When you don't want to open up that information, it's called a trade secret, and you don't publish it and you protect it. I don't think that open source means that we have to give away all of our trade secrets to take advantage of open source. I think we can successfully build and contribute back to the open source community without putting our source code out there on public Git repos.
Any thoughts on that, Rick, on your end?
Huzzah. it's, as a software engineer myself, it's a Jungian thing, the duality of man. It's like I want to, as an application developer, you want to be able to share back to the community, but it's a data thing that we have to be concerned with. I completely understand what Jason is saying. So, what we do in the DoD is fundamentally different than most people do in the commercial industry. So when we use the comparisons, we always have to consider the end state. And if we're going to share our software knowledge or as open source, we better be ready for the ramifications. And if you're not ready, then you shouldn't be doing that. So I'm GitHub, I'm a huge fan of it. I think it's extremely valuable. But there's a balance between how do we, when we go to the DIB and we're saying, hey, industry, help us make these capabilities that are going to make us competitive, because that's what the DoD is about, right? Being competitive. And matter of fact, I'm going to say that I probably said that wrong. I don't want to be competitive. I want to be uncompetitive. I want to be so much ahead that it doesn't matter. And if you're sharing too much, and you're not, this is the trade space, and you're not emphasizing enough of the architecture that understands what you're sharing is going to morph on you, then you're putting yourself at a disadvantage, because now if your adversary is focusing on those things and going, oh, well, look, I can understand the composition of your system better than you can. Chris, I think you shared this. It was like a book that came out that we've now, I think, surpassed our own ability to describe our own systems, right? Yep. This is a complexity thing. Mm-hmm. So when we talk about the millions and millions of libraries of open source that are out there, and we compose those things into a system that provides a set of capabilities for our warfighters, and we can't describe it, that's a problem. So we have to kind of make sure that the emphasis of providing value extremely fast, which is what we need to do, doesn't come at the sacrifice of giving away the keys to the kingdom as well, which is a data problem, right? This is the intellectual property side of the equation. Now, so it's a trade space of moving fast, taking advantage of open source where we can, sharing back to the community when we can, but at the same time, recognizing there's always a risk of what you do.
Yeah, I had a quick follow-on question, Tracy, if I could. This was actually one of my questions, selfishly. In section F of the item F in the memo, it talks about vulnerability information. And going back to Jason's comment about impact levels, it says basically vulnerability information for open source maintained by DoD is considered impact level 2 and must be withheld from public release until the vulnerability is fixed. It makes sense, because you don't want to disclose the vulnerability of an open source that's being currently used by DoD, but couldn't that have an impact on those consuming it as well if you're not disclosing that information? It kind of goes back to the whole dichotomy of that trade space that Rick was just talking about.
Yeah, so I will say that when a security researcher finds a bug, they give the vendor or the community the opportunity to fix that and to have the patch ready to go before it hits, in theory, before it hits the front page of the Wall Street Journal. When we, in my opinion, and I think when we look at impact level 2 with what we're saying, we're trying to just mirror the best practice that's out there today. There's a difference between reaching out to a maintainer and saying, hey, DoD found a very severe vulnerability. Can you work a patch? And doing that in a quiet fashion, like industry does, versus saying, hey, we're just going to withhold it and we're never going to tell you anything about it. And so the other thing that applies there is, these are DoD-led projects, right? There's a difference between being an open source project like CNCF and an open source project where DoD is literally the lead of the project. But regardless, it's best practice to say, hey, look, I found this issue. Here's the test case. Can you work a patch? It's kind of critical. Versus putting out a press release and getting the media on the line and having them blasted all over the front page. So I honestly believe that the DoD has the best intentions of following the lead of the commercial enterprises, letting people know there's this, can you fix it? And then it goes public, as opposed to just blindly going public and seeing where the cards fly.
I think it's a pretty interesting for everyone. on how you've been able to line up and talk about talk about something that is definitely not defense in the same way, but be able to make that relevant. Right? Talking about our secret sauce in the defense industry is the trade secret that a commercial organization has. The same thing here. They don't necessarily want, a commercial organization doesn't want that vulnerability to be known before they get that patch out there. So how quickly they can react to it, they may or may not open that up more quickly to other groups, depending on how much help they need in solving the problem, or in what I'll call it the blast zone is of the issue that they've run into. So I really like how, Jason, how you've lined those things up. I want to come back to something that Rick implied earlier, but didn't really say, and that is about dependencies, dependency graphing, understanding, right, that what's old is new again. So we're back to dependencies. Yay. The architect in me says hooray. There's also value in models. There's
Yes.
value in MOSA. Those to me are things that we should have been done for 25 years. Regardless, what's old is new. How do we blend, though? How do we get to right sizing? Because we could make it a science fair project. We could make it so big and so heavy that we can't move forward, given the size of the models, given the MBSE landscape that we have. You know,
Yes.
how are you starting to address that, Rick, with some of the different organizations that you're working with right now?
Yeah, so that's a great question because, and I actually had a very a deep conversation with several of our folks about this, which you know, there's a part of the equation that makes the emphasis on modeling look like an engineering V, which is contradictory to our approach. So for the efforts I'm working that are very high visibility, it's modeling is a key component of it, because the whole point of a model is to make sure you're measuring the complexity. If you don't, you don't need to model the very minute details of something yet until you understand the operational context of it and have a model in terms of, are you applying value in the right place? So in order to not make it a V, our strategy has always been you do it in parallel. As you're doing engineering, as you're doing your first iterations of agile software development, you're producing a model as a part of the outcome and the artifact as well. You know, as a software engineer, we model software all the time, but and so this is where we're using things like SysML and those kinds of things to go, hey, my capability is going to do X, and oh, by the way, I'm going to interject it into the model as well to make sure that the value of my outcome is a measured thing. You know, like for example, how do you measure how fast you can make a decision? You know, those are very complex things that require modeling be leveraged to the maximum extent possible, so that you're taking a step back from purely just, well, let's write a bunch of thou shalt statements and test it at the end and focus on what we see. Software, again, is always a hypothesis. I keep saying this to a lot of folks. Software is a hypothesis. And if we treat it as such, now we can start to be a little bit more agile, all right? Mm-hmm. So, because we write things in the DOD like they're facts, like I need capability A and it's going to do Z. It's like, no, how about we assume it's going to do this and we want an outcome that's going to be this. And then we model that to demonstrate the value proposition. You know, when we get to you know, the value stream management aspects of this, ideation to product and moving a lot faster, the models in the MBSE actually have to be one and the same. You know, as we deliver products and capabilities, the models just come along.
Well, this will be something for another conversation, another day. We'll dive deeper into how are we going to manage these models. They're not all centrally available to folks. Things are still, they're not centralized like Git yet, not always. Some places we're luckier than others with some programs. But those models are sometimes snapshots and they're becoming static. And so bringing them up to speed, keeping them, you know, it would be similar to the memo where it says, let's not make a copy for ourselves and put it off on the side and somehow make it special for us. Let's keep it centralized. Same thing as we get into our models as we go forward. Chris, I'm seeing the flashes on the right-hand side.
Yeah, there's definitely quite a few questions coming in. One person touched on the acquisition professional, and I know Jason touched on this too, and I think Rick as well. What role do you see the acquisition professional playing in this kind of emerging and evolving use of open source by DoD? I know the memo even talks about the need to kind of build that into the product support strategy and things of that nature. Any comments or thoughts on that?
They're critical. They really are. They are absolutely critical. When you go to a buyer and you say, "Hey, look, I need tires," and you're thinking bicycle tires, and they buy dump truck tires, that's a problem. You need to be able to have the ability to communicate effectively around context and scope and capabilities. And when you get into the software ecosystem and the software world, you start talking about AI, ML, you start talking about data science, you start talking about algorithmic warfare and the needs around that. And they need to understand what you're talking about so that they can negotiate the contract and buy the right thing. Otherwise, you're going to go say, "Hey, I need a tire," and they're going to give you a tire and it's just not going to work. And so I think it is absolutely vital that our acquisition professionals are given the opportunity to educate, to understand this technology growth. And I think therein lies the problem. The tech is moving so fast that software professionals are struggling to stay abreast of all the terminology, all the developments, all what the state of the market is. For somebody whose job is secondary to understand all this stuff and their first priority is contracts and purchasing, it's got to be even more daunting. But their role is critical, make no mistake about it.
Yeah, and that, if I could double down on that, I think the other aspect of that stakeholder lens is the acquisition professional is doing so on behalf of the warfighter. And so when they make those design choices, consideration of the end users has to be the variable on the table. Something I'm very passionate about is complexity. And when I go out on ships and I talk to our sailors and Marines, and we're out there and we're looking at systems, like the idea of open source is great from a software development perspective, but from a warfighter perspective, we're like, okay. So as we adopt these things to provide that value, we have to make sure that it's not at the behest of our E4s and E5s that are sitting there trying to maintain these things. So reducing the complexity, it's not. It's a acquisition professional that makes these acquisition choices, involving and making sure they're cognizant of the delivery end state and knowing that when we send things out, that sometimes our workforce or our warfighters have to be at the forefront of their thought process when they're doing these design choices.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. I was going to say, as someone in cyber, I can attest to, there's a lot of talk about, acquisitions professionals' role in cyber, right? I can attest, it's hard for us to keep up with it, let alone someone that doesn't do cyber full time. A lot of parallels. Another question that came in is there a way we can formally introduce a controlled open source library or libraries where only Gov or .mil contributors can contribute to, maybe associated with some sort of incentivization model that rewards, .gov and .mil contributors?
That's a thought-provoking proposal. I think we have broader problems before we could achieve that. I go back to the number of Git repos that exist around the department, and they are stovepiped. And to get on something like GitLab, which is a commercial vendor tool, requires a license, which means for the average everyday warfighter to roll up their sleeves and contribute, they need to be licensed to do that. And was there planning in the budget cycle to allow free-floating license to enable that? Was there the opportunity under the license model to easily reassign licenses to different people? It gets very quickly complicated and convoluted. It's a great idea, but until we have identity credentialing and identity management across the DoD where we can rapidly pull from that, until we solve things like the licensing problem, it's going to be hard for us to say that there's this idea of a citizen coder in the department. I think the other thing that's worthwhile to keep in mind too is the impact of the level of quality of code. Yes, there are rock stars. There are people whose day job is flying planes and driving tanks, and they majored in computer science and they know what it means to write code. If we aren't careful, like I don't know about the audience, but I don't want to go take my next flight out of Manchester and find out that the pilot had this cool idea and he's been flying for 2 days, right? I want somebody who's got a little more experience. That's not to diminish the role or the value of a contribution from somebody who doesn't do software engineering day in and day out.
Right.
But we could spend a lot of time going through code reviews and explaining to somebody why that code is inefficient, it's problematic, it's non-deterministic, and we don't want to push that out to a jet fighter versus actually vetting some of the folks ahead of time. And so I go back to that. Defense is a highly regulated industry. This isn't the latest startup out of San Francisco. Yes, I want to find ways to help the department tap into the talent of our workforce, but I think it's unrealistic to think that all 900,000 or whatever it is civilian workforce, all 811,000 Guard and Reserve, all 1.3 million active duty should be given Git credentials and the opportunity to issue a pull request.
You know, one thing that came to mind as you were talking about that, Jason, is the necessity that's going to continue to grow for us to be able to mentor those folks as they're coming through the ranks, as they're joining in as a junior coder, as they're learning to be a dev, as they're understanding engineering, as they're growing in their architectural prowess. That having those mentoring opportunities is going to be really important. And it's also going to be imperative for everyone to understand, if you're new at this, that great idea that you have, you may need some help looking over your shoulder. You may need someone with a little bit more experience in the context of the DoD saying, we're not going to commit that. Here's why. Exactly to your point, sir.
Yeah, and I think if you look at special forces, I have a lot of friends from some of my past life experiences that are in special forces. And in some ways, I'll just speak to the Navy because I know it the best, being a Navy guy. If you take somebody who was a pilot who flew electronic warfare in an aircraft and you take them over to SOCOM to support those missions, their advancement in their career is predicated upon them being a pilot. That's really kind of career ending. And there are a lot of folks who don't make the higher ranks because they were pulled into special forces and they're not doing their job. They're not doing what their designator was. And in the defense world, in OPM, in federal world, OPM says there's a 1550, computer science. That's it. Right.
Can I throw a quick comment on that real quick? Actually, it's unrelated to the memo, but I know this is something you and I have spoke about, and I've heard Rick talk about it. Just in the broader context of software and how critical it is, talking about like the software modernization strategy and things like that for DoD. How do we address that lack of pathway, for folks that want to focus on this within DoD, so they don't get pushed out without losing their career advancement opportunities and such?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of things that we can do. First, a lot of people, when I'll stop personal experience, right? I joined the military to learn lots of stuff. I knew that I would have the opportunity to foolishly attempt to satisfy my insatiable thirst for knowledge by joining the military. And I did. I did NEATS modules, Navy Electrical Engineering Technology. I did NEATS modules. I did college that the University of Maryland had at the base. I took advantage of everything that I could get my hands on. I think offering those opportunities are important. But at the end of the day, when you look at force readiness, you look at the mission that needs to be executed, we still need sub-drivers, we still need pilots, we still need tank drivers, we need infantry, we need people in these roles. And so I don't want to discourage them from, hey, this is interesting and I want to learn about this and become more proficient, because someday I won't be driving the submarine. versus, hey, I still need you to be really proficient at driving this submarine quietly, because if war breaks out, I need you to be a rock star. And that's a delicate balance, right? So I look at it as we should provide lots of educational opportunities, but we still have a mission to perform, and we can't have everybody aspire to become a software engineer.
Yeah, well put. I think I'd add out of that. You know, we joust with this challenge all the time. You know, with pulling folks off the fleet, you know, to come and participate. And you know, there's a big difference between being proficient at your day job and saying, hey, I'd like you to actually start, you know, developing software, or actually involved in the development process. And so, you know, those who have a career path in that's perfectly fine. But when you take somebody off and you're now involving them in the process, you know, you mentioned that before, like, hey, do you trust? You know, you have to provide a lot of oversight, and it takes manpower to kind of go, okay, we got a bunch of new folks here, and they're going to make something for us, so let's make sure that thing works. It's a trade space, and I think, you know, you don't want to ignore it, but you have to have it as an integrated part of the process. You know, like when we're talking about human-centered design, or what we like to call warfare-centered design, having an operational context doing that. That's not writing code per se on a daily basis, but maybe involved in it. That's one aspect. And then the other aspect of the folks who really actually want to do contributions, and in making sure that, you know, are you doing it because it's a part of your career growth path, or are you doing it just because you're tinkering and you just love the idea of it and it's your night job? And that, we shouldn't discourage that as well, because we need, you know, in the DoD, we need, you know, as a software is eating the world, we need more software people, and that growth has to be recognized. We have to adopt more in our industry, more software folks. But, you know, taking those sailors and Marines off the front lines to do so could, you know, is a balancing act we have to consider.
Hey, real quick here, we're coming up on, I think we have about 3 or 4 minutes left, and just to be cognizant of both your time and the participants' time, any, you know, kind of final thoughts or comments either you both want to make as we head out of here on the regards to the open source memo, you know, software within DoD more broadly, anything like that?
Rick, you want to go first?
Yeah. So, you know, as the memo comes out, there's actually several memos out there that are actually moving us in the right direction. I'm a huge advocate of everything I've seen coming out lately that's just driving us in the right direction. So as we think about what open source is going to do for us, it's a consideration that I think is incentivizing the programs to consider what some were maybe a little hesitant to consider in the past. And I think that's really where we're going to get some traction. Like, you know, people are like, well, I can't really use open source because I'm afraid of it, or there was a lack of incentive there to use it. So I think the value of having these memos is going to put on the table folks to consider it as a key option, and that'll help us move faster. The other part that actually I think is a part of this equation is, you know, it's rare that you see open source as a one holistic system. Usually it's a combination of a bunch of little mini things, right? So now what it does is it opens up the aperture to transparency and has us think about modularity in a new manner, right? Like, oh, now I can have a bunch of Lego pieces, and my Lego pieces can be changed out a lot faster. That's a consideration that gets us more towards open architecture, which I'm a big fan of. Like, you know, trying to make sure that as we build and design systems, openness is a key aspect that we have to consider. Open source makes us think about those things a lot more than, say, if I just went off and bought something, because I'm hoping if I buy it, it is modular. But when you consider open source as a part of the variable, it helps programs understand that, yeah, that's an attribute I should probably pay attention to, and as a key consideration in the design aspects. Can it be modular? Can I pivot? Can I change where change is needed? What am I doing about that news article that just came out about this thing that we want to take care of that's causing a huge issue in the government? What are we doing about it? You know, those kinds of things help us realize that the ability to pivot is really important.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that and say that the federal government in general and the Department of Defense specifically, since that's who I represent, we've been poor partners in the past. And we are waking up to the fact that we have more to contribute. And it's my hope that the open source memo and dialogues in places and forums like this show that we are trying to take steps that positively affect the outcome as a good partner, as opposed to just a greedy consumer of open source.
So I want to thank everybody. Jason, Rick, it is fantastic that you take the time this afternoon to discuss this with us. It is always amazing and wonderful to get your insights and have you engaging and talking with us. Chris Hughes, thank you for helping us to get this hosted today. For anybody who's involved, we will be having volunteer sessions. I believe it's on March 2nd. I'll put the information out on the page site that we showed you for anybody who'd like to volunteer to be a part of driving more of these conversations. We anticipate that our next coffee chat will be about zero trust architecture. It'll be more of a 101 primer to get everybody accustomed to that other hot topic that's really, really out there right now. Thanks again, everybody. I appreciate your time.